Hello, dear viewers, and welcome to this interview. Today with us, we have an amazing researcher and scientist, Professor Chris Impey. He is a distinguished professor of astronomy at the University of Arizona. He has over 220 refereed publications on observational cosmology, galaxies, and quasars, and his research has been supported by over $20 million in grants from NASA and NSF. Chris Impey is an author of 9 popular science books and over 100 articles on cosmology, astrobiology, and education. He has won 11 teaching awards. Chris Impey is past vice president of the American Astronomical Society, and he has won its Career Education Prize. He also has been an NSF Distinguished Teaching Scholar, Carnegie Council Arizona Professor of the Year, and Howard Hughes Medical Institute Professor. Welcome to our interview, Professor Impey, and it's our great pleasure to have you here with us.
Yes, very pleased to be with you.
We also have Steve, our co-host, here with us today. So, Steve, thank you for being here as well.
Hey, guys. Thank you.
So, our first question is, what led you to study black holes and what attracts you the most about them?
So I learned about black holes when I was a student, of course, and then in graduate school. And, normal mass, stellar mass, dead star black holes have been known for decades. But the ones I was interested in were the big ones. So, in the 70s and 80s, people realized there were energetic, violent phenomena happening in the center of galaxies, some galaxies, not all. And over time, it was clear that the only explanation is a supermassive black hole accreting material and basically generating enormous amounts of energy. So that was a big draw. So for my PhD thesis, and then for many years afterwards, I thought I wanted to study these enigmatic objects and learn about the black holes that power them.
Very cool. Thanks, Chris. So our next question is that a black hole is one of the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe. How would you explain this to a 6-year-old child, exactly what a black hole is?
Right. They're mysterious, but they're actually physically quite simple objects. So I would start by saying they're mysterious, but they're quite simple because all they have is a size and a mass, and they're probably spinning, so they have some angular momentum. Or I wouldn't use that term for a 6-year-old. To explain what's happening, I would just do the analogy where you talk to the child and say, well, you throw something up and comes back down. That's gravity. If you could throw something fast enough over your head, it would leave the Earth forever. And that's quite fast. That's faster than you can throw something. And if you continue this logic, the fastest thing there is light. So there is gravity so strong that you can't throw, the light can't travel, the light can't escape. The escape velocity is the fastest thing there is, 300,000 kilometers per second. And so that's a black hole. And that logic was used before general relativity. The idea of black holes was there in the 18th century, even using Newtonian gravity, just by sort of that kind of extrapolation argument.
So we know there has been a long history of observation and the first theories, but today we have all this modern equipment that is used for observing black holes. And could you tell us a little bit more about what kind of equipment is actually used today in modern observations?
So for stellar, it differs a little bit for the star black holes and the supermassive ones in the center of galaxies. For the star ones, it's often X-ray astronomy that tells you what's going on, because the way we know that black holes exist at all from the late 1960s, when Cygnus X1 was identified as the first black hole. And as the name says, Cygnus X1 is the brightest X-ray source in the constellation of Cygnus. So it was called out by its intense X-ray emission. And we think these black holes are in binary systems where a normal star is funneling mass onto the black hole. And as that material falls into the black hole, it heats up to millions of degrees and glows in X-rays. So right from the beginning of black hole observation, X-rays have always been important. And then for the big black holes in galaxies, same thing. The particle acceleration that's happening near the center of the galaxy extends across the electromagnetic spectrum from radio waves all the way to gamma rays, actually. So Multi-wavelength observations have been important for looking at the big black holes in galaxies, since they emit their energy over an enormous range of wavelengths. So this is a field where astronomers collaborate, and they observe not just in one traditional wavelength of optical astronomy, but they combine the optical with the X-ray and radio and so on. And that's how you get the best in.
Thanks for that. Chris, you're over in Arizona, correct?
Yeah.
Cool. Would you say that Arizona is considered to be one of the better places on the planet for these observations? And if so, why do you think so?
Yeah, we have a big observational capability here. So for observations of black holes, we're a good place. We have 5 mountaintop observatories near Tucson, but actually our biggest telescopes are all now in Chile, because it's, unfortunately, the United States is, even in Arizona, far from a city, it's still quite bright. The sky is getting brighter. So for frontier observations, you need the darkest skies possible. So we have our telescopes in Chile, and those telescopes can do these kind of difficult observations. But we do have a radio telescope here that's part of the Event Horizon Telescope, and the Event Horizon Telescope was a network of radio telescopes around the world that generated that spectacular images of black hole accretion disk and the black hole image that was a front page on newspapers a few years ago. And they've done that now twice. They did that for M87, a giant elliptical galaxy with a billion solar mass black hole. And then they did it more recently for the Milky Way itself, for the more modest sized black hole, but much closer in our own galaxy.
And when it comes to methodology, what kind of methods do exist today for observations?
Well, the main method for example, the method that led to the inference that there's black holes in the center of every galaxy. So that's one of the insights of modern research on black holes, and the big ones, that even when they're not creating very energetic phenomena that mark them out with X-rays and gamma rays, there are black holes in every galaxy, and our own galaxy is a good example, because that's rather a quiet and rather a small black hole. So to find the black holes that are quiet or not actively fueling, you use spectroscopic methods. And that's how we found black holes in the center of galaxies where nothing special seemed to be going on. So basically, you drop a slit of a spectrograph across the center of the galaxy, and you look for the stars or the gas in the center of the galaxy moving incredibly fast, much faster than would make sense if there were just normal rotation of the galaxy in its center, which would be a few hundred kilometers per second. So you see velocities 10 times that, 20 times that. And those velocities are inferring that there has to be a very massive object right at the center. And it's dark, because the galaxy is not doing anything special in terms of shining brightly. So we found black holes as dark objects in the center of galaxies with spectroscopy. And we still use the multi-wavelength method. So when the black holes are active, they're basically huge particle accelerators, and they put their energy across an enormous range of wavelengths. So then you go to your radio telescope, your X-ray telescope, your gamma ray, and you put all that information together to find out the total energy of what's going on.
So while doing all of these observations, could you maybe tell us some of the more interesting phenomenon that you come across in the universe while studying this stuff?
Sure. The interesting questions that are still active research questions, they're not easy to solve with one set of observations, and I've been working on pieces of this for a while. Once you've decided that every galaxy has a black hole, which is pretty much what we've decided, they may be hard to find, but if you look hard enough, you do find them. The question then becomes, why are most of them dark most of the time? So why, if black holes can occasionally erupt into activity, and then we call them quasars, basically, where the central object outshines the entire rest of the galaxy by a factor of hundreds or thousands. That's incredible. So what's going on that means either some small fraction of all galaxies do this, or they do it for some small fraction of the time? Because things in astronomy take, cosmological timescales, millions, billions of years. You can't stare at one black hole and understand its fueling cycle or how it behaves. You just get a little snapshot. So you have to do surveys and piece together the story. And those surveys have led to the conclusion that it's not some subset of galaxies that are special, and that's why their black holes are active. But every galaxy has black holes that are quiet most of the time, say 99% of the time, and then flare into activity and shine incredibly brightly, and then that subsides, and so on. That's what people have been learning. And it's taking, I've done bits of those projects, but there's a lot of, these are such big questions that no single person or single observation will answer those questions. There's dozens of people and big collaborations working on these things.
If it comes to you, what in your opinion is the most realistic life cycle? Do you have your own theory about life cycle of a black hole? And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I mean, I sort of said we can't observe them in real time, but that's not totally true. We've now been observing some black holes for a few decades, big black holes in galaxies, and we've seen episodes of activity. So we can see black holes flaring, not huge flares, but we can see possibly situations where a single star is being eaten by the black hole and there's a pulse of energy that comes out. So we've sort of watched the fueling happen on a small scale in limited ways and then piecing the bigger story together. And it seems like the active phase will probably only last maybe 10 or 50,000 years, and then you can have a few million years of quietness. Question of why it's that way is partly because when the black hole is active, it's putting out a lot of energy, but also a lot of radiation pressure, which drives away gas. So essentially, the black hole is fueling from material that falls into it from an accretion disk. And then when it's active, it kind of blows away the material. So it's sort of like a binge and purge. It's like somebody who overeats dramatically and then gets exhausted and then has to rest for a while. So it drives away its own fuel when it's active. And then the center of the galaxy doesn't have any gas or stars nearby. And so gravity has to gradually accumulate more matter in the center of the galaxy, triggering a new cycle of activity. And when you do that simulation, say in a computer, to see how long that might take, you get the answer of a few million years that it would take. And so we've never, of course, observed that happen over a few million years, but that's a inference we're drawing from observations so far.
Very cool. We'd like to discuss a little bit of your research described in the book you wrote, Einstein's Monsters. Mm-hmm. And we are pretty eager to understand this question, which you did actually already answer in terms of these things being in the center of galaxies. But how would you describe a supermassive black hole, like the functions and characteristics? And what might you say are like the fundamental differences between something like a supermassive black hole and a stellar black hole?
So the distinction between massive, supermassive, and is a little arbitrary. So there's a continuous spectrum of black holes. So in addition to finding that there's essentially a black hole in every galaxy, for a few decades, we've seen that there's a correlation between the mass of the central black hole and the mass of especially the old stars in the surrounding galaxy, such that the biggest galaxies with old stars, which are giant elliptical galaxies, have the biggest black holes. And a galaxy like the Milky Way, which has a lot of young stars and a much smaller number of old stars, and it's a less massive galaxy, has a modest black hole. So that scaling is interesting, and it's telling us something about the black holes, how they form and how they grow. And it's still not completely understood. I mean, the other thing to bear in mind, because people think black holes consume everything and they dominate everything, they don't in terms of the numbers. First of all, the black holes in the center of galaxies, they really only dramatically affect regions very close to the center, maybe 10, 100 light years. The galaxy is 100,000 light years across. So it's a tiny fraction of the center of the galaxy that's strongly affected. And even the effects of general relativity are only felt near the event horizon. Once you go 10 or 100 times the event horizon distance, it's pretty much Newtonian gravity. So people think black holes are eating everything and distorting space-time everywhere. No, it's pretty localized in the center of the galaxy. And then in terms of the mass, in this scaling relation, basically the black holes are 0.1% of the total mass of the galaxy. So they're not dominant at all. They're really a very small fraction of the mass of the galaxy.
That's very interesting. So we should not be afraid of the ones in the center of the galaxy because they don't affect the whole galaxy.
Or even the nearby one. So right, so that one in the Milky Way, that's 27,000 light years away, and it's also fairly inactive, so it's absolutely no danger, and it's not even very spectacular to look at. It took radio telescopes and a lot of data to drill down and even show that it existed.
And from the perspective of the black hole's existence, in your opinion, what happens to the information in the black hole? Is it being lost forever, or is it preserved somewhere and possibly potentially even recoverable? And in your opinion, what is the definition of this information?
Yeah, this is still a controversial topic. So the simplest thing that we can say about black holes is they have very high entropy or disorder. So a black hole that the sun will not become a black hole. It will die as a white dwarf. It's too low mass. But if you had a black hole the mass of the sun, it would have an entropy that was 100 million times the entropy of the sun. So that's a fundamental fact about black holes. They have very high entropy or disorder, more colloquially. And what does that mean? I mean, intuitively, it's easy to understand. Because when you have a black hole, you don't know what it was made from, right? It's because you can't see inside it. The objects that went into it to form a black hole are invisible to you. So in principle, there are many, many, many ways you could evolve to form black holes that look essentially the same. The question of the information content of the black hole is as I mentioned, an unresolved research question. On its face, it seems that the information is lost because, by definition, the event horizon is an information barrier. It's an information membrane. Information can go in, but it can never come out. So black holes are information sinks. And so in the simplest definition of a black hole, the information is lost. Now, not all theorists were happy with that. And they wondered, Stephen Hawking famously among them, and they wondered if maybe that's not completely true. And out of that doubt or exploration of really was the information lost, they imagined ideas like the holographic principle, where things that as information in a formal, structured matter or structured information falls towards the event horizon, and the clock, the time, slows down infinitely at the event horizon. They also imagined that maybe the structure in that information is also preserved and essentially frozen on the event horizon, just as time freezes for anything that falls towards it. That makes some sense. And so that's the basis of the holographic principle, that the event horizon of a black hole, which we can't really inspect observationally, so this is just a theory, maybe when stuff that's actually in the black hole is truly lost to the rest of the universe, but perhaps the information that fell into the black hole is sort of coded onto the event horizon in the way that a hologram codes information. So that's been a proposal, a hypothesis, starting 40 years ago. It's been around quite a long time. Question is, how would you test it? And there it gets tricky because we don't have observations. Astronomers' tools are just too crude to get to those very, very small scales of the event horizon. We have all these indirect ways. The Event Horizon Telescope was the first time we ever made images of a black hole, a massive black hole. And that's as close as we've got. And they're beautiful images, but they don't have a lot of detail. So they're not going to address the information question. And a sidebar on the information question is, of course, it leads to this information paradox, as people have called it. And that's based on something that has to be reconciled between black hole physics and quantum physics, or the physics of fundamental particles. Because it's a premise of quantum mechanics, which is highly successful physical theory, that particle interactions flow with equal probability forward and backward in time, or between particles and antiparticles. And we can do this in the lab and show that that's true. So fundamental particle interactions are completely reversible. A black hole breaks that reversibility, of course, because the event horizon, makes it irreversible, and that is still seen as a problem. And that's the basis of the information paradox, as it's called. How do you reconcile the ostensible information loss in a black hole with the reversibility that's foundational to quantum theory. And then, there are clever ideas, and I'm not a theorist, I'm an observer and I read the literature. But again, these issues have been around for a couple of decades, and they generate a lot of interesting theoretical papers and conversations at meetings, but there's no resolution of these issues right now.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. There's so much to discover, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe the tools will get better. I mean, if the observational, so the trouble with this aspect of black holes is the theory is kind of uncomfortably far ahead of observation. So the theorists have a lot of fun. They invent all these ideas, and the observers go to the meetings and say, well, okay, that's nice, but how do I test this? How do I show whether it's just speculation or true? Science, as you know, is healthiest when the interplay between theory and observation is very tight. The coupling is tight and the feedback is tight. And then you make progress pretty rapidly because you hone your ideas and throw out the ones that don't work and refine the good ones, and everything moves neatly. Black hole physics is a little tricky now because the theories are, the theoretical basis in general relativity is strong, and we've had that theory for a century, and it's passed every test with flying colors, including black hole tests. So that's great, but the observations are really hard. And so this is a place where observations have to somehow catch up.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly. Is there anything else that you can add in terms of when an object actually starts approaching a black hole and falls into it? What exactly happens to an object?
Sure. The tidal forces are intense, and that's the basis of the argument that you would never want to be near a black hole physically, because it's not the total gravity of the black hole it's a problem. It's the stretching force, the difference between the gravity on your head and your feet if you were close to the event horizon. And that essentially would rip you apart in a very uncomfortable way, because it's not just like someone like with a kid, you would pull on their legs and pull on their arms and they get a nice stretch. This is stretching you at every scale. So stretching at the level of muscles, tendons, fibers, molecules, and nobody knows what that would actually feel like. I'm sure it would be very uncomfortable, and you would eventually die. So black holes have this intense tidal force.
There was something very interesting you mentioned before about the black hole creating its ray of beam of energy after consuming an object. What is the nature of this ray? And are there any recent studies that maybe give us a little bit more insight about its effect on the surrounding areas and whatever comes in?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are two types of things we could talk about. The sort of episodic sort of activity of a black hole when it ingests matter, maybe a star or a high density clump of gas. Those are called tidal disruption events, TDEs. They have their acronym in the field. And that creates that's a sort of an accretion pulse. So it's a sort of ingestion of matter and an acceleration of matter that's localized in time, may take a few years, 10 years. And the particle acceleration that goes with that creates an X-ray pulse when gamma rays as well. And that's how it's observed. And people have actually managed to use multi-wavelength observations where they can see the energetics of it through the high energy, the X-rays and gamma rays. But using optical methods or infrared methods, they can actually see the material. They can measure Doppler shift of the material and see that it's falling in. So that they're telling nice little stories of these episodic events, these tidal disruption events. You have to be lucky to see one, because the black holes are fueling over enormous time spans. And, I suppose if you're staring at enough of them long enough, you'll get lucky and you'll see tidal disruption events. But there haven't been many. There have only been maybe 8 or 10 that have ever been seen, and most not studied very well because they didn't have the right telescopes pointing at them. The other more generic feature of black holes is because they're always spinning. They formed from, a massive object or a set of stars that had some angular momentum, and as they collapse, the angular momentum is conserved. So they're spinning quite fast, and that leads to the accretion disk, which is funneling fuel onto them along the equator. They evacuate, the polar regions are evacuated, very low density plasma, and there's a magnetic field, of course, associated with a black hole. And so you have the plasma accelerated along the poles, and that leads to these jets. And those jets were first observed with radio telescopes a long time ago. Actually, in the 1950s, radio galaxies were observed with radio telescopes before anyone really knew what was going on or what was powering those bizarre radio jets that extended far beyond the confines of the galaxy. Well, over time, with much better radio telescopes, we've studied these jets, these radio jets, on very many different scales, including going right down into the nucleus. And it's a pretty general phenomenon of these active black holes, that they are creating twin relativistic jets, relativistic plasma that is coming from the poles of the black hole and is being ejected at, again, relativistic speeds, too far beyond the galaxy itself, hundreds of thousands, even sometimes a couple of million light years out into space in two directions. And then radio telescopes get to observe that. So it's observations that have been around for half a century, but we didn't really understand what was driving this until more recently.
Which recent discoveries in the studies of black holes, like which ones of the more recent ones do you find the most interesting and noteworthy, and why do you think that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of activity and interest in the sort of chicken and egg question, because if every galaxy has a black hole, which came first? Did the black hole come first or the galaxy come first? We have a theory of cosmology, generally supported by a lot of data, that galaxies grow in a hierarchical way, that the early universe, which was hotter and denser, formed small dwarf galaxies first, and then by gravity they aggregated together and merged into bigger galaxies. And we know galaxies have formed by mergers and by infall. We can see it even happening now in the Milky Way. So that's a story that we believe. And then the question is, how does the black hole that's at the center of every galaxy fit into this story? And the reason it's in the stakes on this question, which sounds very esoteric, got raised because as people studied high redshift galaxies, they found unusually big, uncomfortably big black holes in very high redshift galaxies. So if you find a billion solar mass black hole in a galaxy that's only a billion years after the Big Bang, that's hard to do. Growing a black hole that big, that fast is challenging theoretically and with simulations. And it was even viewed as being, a threat to cosmology overall, that these things existed. That threat was overplayed. I think that's not really the issue, that cosmology is wrong because of these observations. But the question still remains, how does it happen? And these are all now very early epochs of the universe where the observations are hard. This is what James Webb Space Telescope was built for, actually. First light, but also first black holes, first stars, first galaxies, all those things together. And so this is an unresolved question. If you believe simulations, people try and do simulations of that early phase of the universe. In some of those simulations, you form kind of seed black holes very quickly. That gas just collapses strongly by gravity, and you actually form stellar type black holes that are much bigger than the black holes we see around us. For stellar mass black holes, most of them are like 10, 20 times the mass of the sun, but theoretically and observationally, they can go up to about 100 times the mass of the sun. But in the early universe, they could be hundreds of times the mass of the sun, maybe up to 1,000. So there's clear reason to believe that you could form some seed black holes hundreds of times the mass of the sun very quickly, really before much galaxy formation has happened at all. And then you'd have the black holes first, and then they'd pull matter onto them, and gas would come in and form stars. And so you form the black hole first, and then the galaxy around it. And then everything kept merging and building. And some people who have run different simulations or have different theoretical ideas don't agree with that, and they still think that the best or the most plausible way is you form these small galaxies, and within the small galaxies, you form much more modest black holes. And then as those dwarf galaxies merge, of course, the black holes in the center just combine like arithmetic, and you just gradually build big black holes. But that latter method doesn't necessarily get you to a billion solar masses in a billion years. So the more conventional way of doing it with little galaxies with little black holes gradually merging, it's too slow. The merger process and the growth process is kind of slow. And so that's what's driving people to these slightly more unusual ideas.
But that is incredible because it states that there could be an essential role that a black hole plays in formation of galaxies, which is mind-blowing.
Yeah, and it sort of that's a good point, because it inverts what I was saying earlier, that black holes in the modern universe are kind of insignificant. They're like 0.1% of a galaxy. Why would you care? Well, maybe at the beginning they were really important. They were essential to the whole story.
So, as a scientist who passionately studies this subject for many, many years, why do you think black holes appear in the universe, and what is their purpose?
Well, I mean, black holes appear in the universe because, gravity is the dominant force. It's a long-range force, and it's by far the weakest of the four forces of nature. But in overall, and especially in the early universe when the density was high, gravity is a very powerful force. And so, when matter is collapsing under gravity, it's a natural way to form black holes. So in a sense, it would almost be surprising if there were no black holes, because gravity in the early universe is powerful. There's just it's a natural thing for gravitational collapse to happen, and you have units of gas and matter that are big enough to make significant sized black holes early on. So it's almost like the opposite. It would be surprising if there were no black holes in the universe, given the power of gravity and the role of gravity. Now, it doesn't really tell you how many black holes there should be or how many of different sizes. Those are observational questions that we're still trying to answer. The Milky Way has about 20 million stellar mass black holes. It has about 100 million neutron stars, but it has a few 100 billion normal stars. So again, black holes are relatively small population.
What do you think are some of the most significant achievements in terms of the research of black holes, and what sort of questions are people still asking that remain unsolved that are exciting for you to ask?
I would start with gravitational waves. The fact that the discovery of gravitational waves by LIGO in 2016, 2015, 2016, is proof beyond any doubt that black holes exist, because the only way to explain those signals is by black hole mergers. And LIGO is now seeing a black hole merger every few weeks, roughly every month. It's almost routine now. And that, of course, led to a Nobel Prize a few weeks ago. So the observation of gravitational waves from merging black holes is a spectacular achievement. It's an incredible experiment, of course, the most accurate physics experiment in history by orders of magnitude. And now it's becoming routine. And black hole and gravitational wave observations are becoming routine. There's LIGO, there's the Virgo instrument in Europe. The Japanese have an instrument. There's a whole network of gravity wave observatories, and we're planning to put LISA in space, which will look at the merger of very big black holes, which has never been done. So that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is the imaging of the black holes by the Event Horizon Telescope in the last 5 or 6 years. And those observations are spectacular because we've never been able to see, the event horizon and the black hole as a silhouette on it. They've also allowed us to test general relativity in new ways. And it's passed all those tests in the strong gravity situation. But that, again, was a big success. And then the other one, more locally, is the one of our own galaxy. So people now, having shown that there's a dark object in our galaxy and measured its mass to be about 4 million solar masses, and that also was a Nobel Prize some years ago. Now we're studying it in more detail. The methods of adaptive optics and infrared observation allow us to study the motions of dozens of stars right near the event horizon. And those are allowing us to test general relativity in even more detailed ways with this nearest big black hole. It doesn't generate headlines from month to month or year to year necessarily, because people are accumulating data. But you can see stars. Eventually, you're going to see stars that actually go behind the black hole and are silhouetted by it, and you'll see stars falling into it if you're patient enough and have enough stars that you're studying. So our own galaxy's black hole observations are yielding very interesting things. So I'd say those are the three areas where there's been a lot of progress.
What are the most exciting and unresolved topics and questions for you in the field of research and studying the black holes?
Well, I'm not a theorist, but the information paradox is a big deal. I mean, there are 150 theoretical papers written about this every year. It's a very active field. People talk about a firewall. There's the holographic principle. There's all these ideas. So I hope it is a very exciting topic that I try and follow, but I'm not participating in that research directly. It's theoretical. So that's a very exciting topic. And then this chicken and egg question of black holes first or galaxies first. So those two. And then just continuing to test general relativity. Most of the tests of general relativity, and it's passed so many tests over a century, were weak field tests of general relativity, where the gravity is not strong. You know, with LIGO, with black hole mergers, and with the Milky Way black hole, we can test general relativity in the strong field situation, where the number of tests has been quite limited. And it's, you know, it may fail some of those tests. It's passed every test. That doesn't guarantee what will happen in the future. So pushing the envelope of general relativity, which we know is not the ultimate theory of gravity, because it doesn't accommodate quantum physics and, you know, fundamental particles. So we know that it's not the final solution on gravity. So continuing to push that theory is really important and exciting.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an incredible interview and so many things. Like they say, if people are really passionate and they know their subject, they can explain it to a 6-year-old and make a kid interested and happy. And we hope that this information that you shared with us today will inspire a lot of new researchers and people to study, to look into it more. And who knows, with the recent advances of science, I think it goes way faster than it used to. And we might get answers to the questions we discussed today so much sooner than we think, hopefully.
Or maybe some of those 6-year-olds learning about black holes for the first time will grow up and solve some of these problems.
Absolutely, they should.
I hope they go into science, of course.
We hope so too. And we are very thankful for your time and for the information that you shared with us today. Would you like to wish something to the viewers and maybe share your message to the audience of our channel?
I've done a couple of shows for ALLATRA TV, and I'm very pleased with the quality of your programs, and I enjoy your participating in these discussions, and I've had some forums and some roundtables. So I hope you all keep an interest in science. So if you're interested in science and you're interested in the esoteric objects of the universe, then I encourage you to, read, watch videos, watch shows like this, and, maintain your interest and ask questions. Science is just about asking questions, some of which have answers and many do not, but the asking of questions is how it all starts.
Absolutely. Yes, you're absolutely right. The freedom to share information is so essential, and we know it better than anyone else. And only when we put together all the different researchers, all the pieces of the puzzle together, we start seeing a more complete picture. And yes, not all of us are professionals in the scientific field, but all of us are very curious people. And we are seeing that with our audience. There are a lot of people who would love to know more about the processes inside of our planet and all of its spheres, and of course, the universe. It's fascinating.
Well, I encourage you to keep doing that good job of telling the truth and spreading the truth.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Great questions. Thank you.
And for all of our viewers, thank you so much for being with us today. Please share your thoughts on this interview in the comment section below and write what kind of questions would you like to get answers to and what kind of research would you be intrigued with. And what are your thoughts on the topic of the black holes as it is? Thank you.